Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi guys, welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us. We have a special guest today. Her name is Rachel Venable, and she is a veterinarian oncologist. So she actually deals with a lot of grief-ridden loss with her patient population of dogs and cats. And she's here today to help us understand how to explain things to our kids and what happens in the process of losing a pet and how to best handle that. With that, let's get to Rachel.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay. So we're going to be talking about pet loss today. And I know that, if we have a pet, like they can't live forever, unfortunately. Right. And in the human world, we don't live forever either. And so what things should we be thinking about when it comes to like the end of our pet's life?
There's a lot of things to take in. I'm a cancer specialist. I'm a vet oncologist. So I always see things kind of from that perspective, when they have cancer, and often it's not curable. So it can be this hard, do you stop? I feel like a lot of people, they struggle with this a lot. One, because we don't euthanize people, and that's always an option in animals. Yeah. And so it can be really difficult to know, well, when do I stop? Because there's some spectrum I find where people, if they know their pet has a non-curable disease like cancer, they don't want to wait for them to start being uncomfortable. And so they may euthanize early, versus other people feel like, I think that they're letting their pet down if they didn't try or do things, or they don't want to do things too early. And so it can be a really hard thing to know. And I have found over the years, it's very different for different people. So I think some good rules of thumb, though, are trying to manage or monitor for quality of life, how you feel like that's going for your pet, as well as, talking with your vet, like medically, when do we think they're uncomfortable or actually starting to suffer?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are good things to take in consideration. So when you are thinking, you mentioned euthanasia. So like, what does it mean to euthanize a pet, and like what happens in the pet's body, and are they in pain? I know that in our house, we unfortunately had one of our dogs had their stomach flip, and then it was like super painful. And, we talked to the vet, and the decision that we made as a family was to euthanize because our dog was just in so much pain, and they did not feel like the pet would survive surgery. And so, we had to do this like suddenly, and it wasn't something that we could really prepare for. But I know that, my kids were there, not during the actual euthanasia process, like being euthanized, but that they were part of this process. And so what do we need to know about this experience?
Yeah. And I'm so sorry you went through that. That's pretty traumatic.
Yeah. It sucks to lose a pet, right? And also just like suddenly, yes.
Yeah, that's terrible. So yeah, as far as what happens, like when we say euthanasia, what are we even talking about? So basically it's an overdose of anesthetic drugs. And so most vets, there's going to be a little bit of variability, but essentially we give an overdose of an anesthetic, and then usually it's a sedation like propofol. Often we'll give some propofol so that the pet actually falls asleep. So meaning that they're not mentally present, however you want to define sleep, maybe when you're talking about anesthesia, but that they're not feeling anything anymore. They're still, and then we inject another drug. The drug that we give in basically a large overdose when the pet is already very sedate. So it's a very controlled, peaceful process that we go through. Depending on what's going on with your pet, and I think a lot of vets too, will kind of warn people, sometimes when we start to sedate them, when they start to fall asleep, like if they're in heart failure, you may see fluid coming out of their nose, or you may see, fluid maybe coming out of their mouth. So even though it's peaceful, it's still difficult for people. Sometimes pets will also take really big breaths, or, again, it sort of depends on what all is going on in their body. But I would say it's still much more controlled and peaceful compared to naturally passing. Death, unfortunately, is not a peaceful process most of the time. Even in people, often when you're truly passing away, it's not usually a peaceful thing. The body kind of fights till the end. And so these drugs, it just helps where it's much more controlled. And so the pets don't feel anything. So it's not painful during these injections or during that time. But it is something that it just usually, like I said, can go pretty smoothly unless things like, if they have heart failure or, if they have a bleeding disorder, you are going to see some things. So sometimes just prepping people for just that, when the body stops, some of the things that can happen.
Yeah. Which would happen maybe normally if your body was stopping, right? But that we're inducing this can be bothersome to people to see and witness for sure. So I know that when Finn, our dog, passed away, they also listened to his heart afterwards. Why was that?
Well, so there's actually two things for that. So one is we want to, when we give this overdose of the drug, it does stop the heart. So essentially when the heart stops beating, we know that they have passed away, that they've died. Also, it is somewhat an act so we can let pet owners, it's sort of a nonverbal to tell people that your pet is officially gone. And I think it just really helps, like I said, not saying it, but people saying it, that they know, okay, this is final and that they've gone.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you think we talk to our children about sick pets or about the death of a pet? Because sometimes we have preparation, right? Like with our dog at that time, it wasn't something that we weren't prepared. But then there are times like with cancer where it's like maybe a longer term process. How do you feel like we prepare our kids for that?
I do think it's important because often for children, the death of a pet is the first time they've ever experienced death. And so, if you're not careful, you could actually do it quite bad, right? Or hopefully this can be something where they have a better understanding. Because I think also as a society, as we're moving away from farms, because when you live out in the country and on a farm, you see a lot of birth and death and all this stuff. But most people anymore don't see any of that. And sometimes even adults, I find, that it's the first time they've ever seen death or had anybody die, even just, with a pet. And especially kids, because the pet, they're usually really close to the pet unless they're really young kids. And so things you can do to help prepare them. I think at some point, whenever you decide, I do think it's important to kind of let them know that, Fluffy is sick. And again, you're the therapist, so I don't want to use any wrong words. Yeah. But I do think it helps just so that they can kind of prepare, that they understand. And again, this also is going to depend on the age of the kid, right? Like a toddler versus a teenager, you're going to talk about this much differently. But I do think, letting them know that they're not feeling well, that they are sick. And the other thing I think that's important with kids is to not use words like, we put Fluffy to sleep, because, I've definitely heard stories where kids are then terrified to go to sleep because they think they won't ever wake up, And so I think sometimes with kids, and again, you can help me with this, what wording, but I feel like you want to be a little more like, Fluffy died. Fluffy was very sick and she died, or, making it more clear, especially for the little ones so that they aren't afraid. Or, back when we were kids, even my in-laws, my husband didn't find out till he was almost 40, but one of their dogs that went to the farm actually never went to the farm. And so, they actually had euthanized him. So I guess maybe that depends on your family. But for me, I think sometimes kids could have issues, maybe even with abandonment. Like, why did you send, Fluffy to the farm? Why didn't Fluffy ever come back? So it probably depends on your kid and the age. But I think being more upfront and using more true terms. What do you find with kids? Yeah. Well,
you're definitely on the right track. This is exactly what I say. So my first rule of thumb is like anytime we can talk about the cycle of life, just in general, right? Without even having a sick pet or a sick family member, that we're just talking about like the trees, right? Like we have this, if you live in a place where you have 4 seasons, you get to see the life of the tree, right? In the spring and summer coming out, and then the death kind of the tree, right? Where the leaves are falling, and being able to just talk about like it's normal for things to be born and also normal for things to die. And, in our house, like we get flowers from the market, right? And then it will be like, oh, these flowers are so beautiful, love it. And then they'll be like, oh, they died, right? So being very literal, and, we do throw flowers away. We're not giving a service or anything for them, but being able to just talk about this process just in everyday life, I think gives kids a preparation for when this happens. Because I think the reality is it's not if somebody or something like an animal or pet will die, it's when. And so knowing that the joy of having a pet is 1,000 times in my mind worth the loss, right? Because of all the joy and even loving family members and those kind of things. Like it's not worth it to me to separate from that, to not have close connections because of that fear. But we do need to kind of prepare our kids. Obviously, if it's a sudden thing, there's not a lot of preparation. Like in our house, we had already been talking about, and our kids are, unfortunately, maybe familiar with death. And so they were able to handle that actually really well. We navigated through that, and we made choices. Like one of my kids wanted to go to school, and the other one didn't. The other one didn't have school. Like it was a wild thing. And then we had the toddler who was not in school. So, I mean, it was all over the place in terms of what my kids wanted to do, but like allowing them to have a little bit of control in that place of like choosing what do you feel ready for. And that I think is good, but also using language around being very direct. Like I think we want it to be peaceful. And so that's why we say something like Fluffy went to sleep, or we put Fluffy to sleep because we're thinking sleep is peaceful, but that can also create fear. So being like Fluffy died, or Fluffy has died, or, Fluffy was sick, or, something about that being very direct that you feel like your kid can handle. Even toddlers can handle that part. They may not be really well versed in terms of their understanding that death is permanent, but like that language helps them to navigate through. And I think the being honest part is also helpful, right? Like you said, the farm thing may seem lovely, right? But then they're like, why did my parents send our favorite dog to the farm? Like everything was good and now they're gone. But I think we think that we're sparing our kids this pain, but the reality is we're going to experience loss in our lives in other ways. And so we cannot protect our kids from all of that, but it actually opens the door to allowing them to process it with us, because we're also probably having emotions too. And so it's okay for you to cry and say that you're sad. I think another thing that I suggest to families is also just like talking about stories, right? Of like that pet and, remembering them, and maybe having a special place in their yard where they have a rock or something, or they plant a tree, or right, to like remember that person. Drawing pictures of them is helpful, right? And I think even when we talk about like the death process, my kids were very curious about burial versus like cremation kind of thing. And in the pet world, I think you can cremate and the pet doesn't come back to you, and you can cremate and the pet does come back to you. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I would say most places. Yes.
Yeah. So we have chosen to get our pets' ashes back, mostly because my kids want them. And so that helps them to remember, that pet. And so just talking about what that is, like factually, like, and you tell me if this is wrong, but in cremation, they put it in the body in a kiln. And then after the kiln gets to whatever temperature and it's done its process, then they take what's remained and basically grind it up to put it in a urn or some type of container.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, kids may not love that idea, but it's like, my kids were like, would they put somebody who's alive in like crematorium? And I'm like, no, like, right. Like, so it's, I think the more direct that we are, and they do ask hard questions sometimes about this, like, why did they have to die? And it's like, this is a good question. Like, I don't have an answer to this. And so it's okay to not be the expert on all of the things. But I think also sometimes my kids ask me questions about death and I'm like, I need to look into this. So I would encourage parents to also be able to put that pause, because sometimes what they ask, you do know the answer to, or you feel like you do, but you want some space to be able to think about that, to be thoughtful about what you say. But it can be so hard. And then I think we can also talk about like parents will talk about like what happens when you die. And I think, there's religious beliefs around this and those families can utilize that. But I think, I like this idea of saying like some people think this and other people think that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, that's it. That's a good way, especially if you don't have like a set, and even still with some religion, when it comes to animals, sometimes people are like, I don't really know. So yeah, I like that question. I like how you put it. And
yeah, it can be hard, but yeah.
Well, yeah, and I was just gonna say, I like how you also point out, like, it's important to be direct. I think so much in our own lives, we try to shield ourselves from anything uncomfortable. We try to do everything we can to not do something uncomfortable. But the reality is, it always happens, like you said. And I think also with our kids, we feel like, well, we have to protect them from this, but it's going to happen. So why not let it, like you said, with us in a more controlled setting versus, other things that we know at some point in life is going to come up. So yeah, I think the death of a pet, like, and you said, drawing, remembering, I think that is all great too. It just really helps the kids process what's going on because it is sad.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are times where, I still miss the pets that have died, even if it was years and years ago. Like, I think about like, I wish this pet was still here because we had such a relationship. And I think, every family is different, but in our house, pets are part of our family. So they are family members. And so it is hard and it does hurt and people are going to be sad. But then also sometimes people process it differently. And maybe there's not a lot of tears. In our house, lots of tears, but not in every house. Like sometimes it's more cerebral, like it's a thought for some people versus the emotional side of it. So how do we talk to kids about euthanasia, right? Like, I think this part of like, we talked about what it is. What do you think we can say to our kids around this to help them understand maybe why we're doing this or what this process is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think first you probably need to come back to, as the adult, why are we doing euthanasia? Because like you said, we don't do it in most places in people. And so, in animals, and essentially why veterinarians will often talk to people about it is because we are really sparing the pet from having to pass naturally. As I mentioned, passing naturally, generally speaking, is not peaceful. It's not comfortable. It can even be traumatic in a lot of situations. And so with euthanasia, when you're giving an overdose of these anesthetic drugs, it's a much more controlled, much more peaceful process. And so basically you get to save the animal from having to go through, the more painful process of naturally dying. And sometimes, again, like with cancer, depending on where it is and where it's located, it could be a long time before they truly succumb to it. But it's been a very, all the organs failing, it's a comfortable, we don't have enough meds to make them comfortable, if we tried to keep them alive. And then the other big question to think about is, how is the quality of life? I think that's something with animals, especially, people think more about, if Fluffy can't hang out with the family and maybe play with certain toys, then does she have any quality of life? Like what are we doing? If she's just sort of a pile of tissue on the counter or on the corner of the room and she won't do anything, so I think thinking about for yourself why you're euthanizing, and then I think explaining to kids, to me, I would go for, Fluffy just is, a lot very sick. And we didn't want her to go through any more pain or have to suffer. And so this was a way that we could help her, end things more peacefully. And, and again, you could add in that, Fluffy just really, her life, she just wasn't able to do anything that she used to enjoy doing. And she was very uncomfortable. So, we worked with the doctor and I think, because I think some people who are really against euthanasia are really struggling with it. Like, you don't want to be direct and say you killed the pet, because that sounds terrible. This is more of a, we're peacefully helping the pet pass, right? So that's where, like, being direct, but also, think about your wording, because we don't want it to sound like it's something forceful or bad, but it's a way that we can help them, not have to go through so much suffering.
Yeah. And I think an important part, and I'm sure you do this, is to say like the pet can't get better, right? Like, so I think oftentimes when kids are sick, right? Like we're always like, and you'll get better, right? Like you don't feel really good. You just threw up, but you're going to get better, right? Like that kind of thing. But it's like our pet cannot get better, right? They're not going to get better. And this is the end of their time, their life. They are already dying. And that this is just to make this a more comfortable process of death.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's important, like you said, to make sure they understand that they're in a place where they're not going to get better.
Yeah. Which can be so hard. And it's hard for us. I mean, like, I struggle with this. Like we have lost over the years, we are big pet people and we've lost lots of animals, unfortunately. And it sucks every time. There's not a time that I'm like, okay, I'm getting used to this. Like, I think loss is awful every time. For me, at least, right? So how do you think we support our other pets through this loss process? So like, I know that, before our recent dog passed away, our other dog a year before had passed away, and the dog that was still alive, he was struggling. Like he was kind of depressed. And so I think that brought awareness to me that like pets grieve too.
They do. And it is interesting sometimes. And I've seen this even with pets, even when I was growing up, and sometimes owners will tell me like, it's almost like the other animal doesn't know where the other one went. You know, it's kind of like they're looking for them around the house or around the property. And that's always heartbreaking. So I think there's a couple different things you can do. And again, it depends on the situation. You know, if you're in an emergency type situation, this probably isn't possible. But if it's something more, you know, old age, cancer type, you know, heart failure type stuff. So sometimes animals, even when they're around each other more and the other one's sick, you can start to tell that they recognize, like they'll start sniffing them more, you know, but like different, right? And sometimes even animals will start to disconnect. Like you'll even notice them where they can tell like, okay, you know, Fluffy is really sick, and they actually quit interacting as much. And so honestly, when that happens, then I find those other pets who have kind of stopped interacting, it's like they understand what's going on and they seem to really usually handle it a little bit better. The other thing, if you don't think that that's happened, or you don't know or haven't noticed, sometimes you can do like euthanasia in your house, depending on, you know, the different services, or you may even bring your other pet to the vet clinic. Because I do find that when the other pet does pass away, your pet that's still with you, they smell them, they recognize like they're gone, you know? So I think that helps with that separation in a sense. And I do feel like that kind of helps with them as far as grieving. And then otherwise, sometimes they are just sad. And I find that it is kind of like people, and, you know, anything you can do, maybe even having them around. And again, this is going to depend a little bit on the pet, but maybe having them around some other dogs so they're getting more stimulus and, you know, getting some interaction. But I feel like sometimes too, when they know the other one has passed away, it seems to usually help a bit more with that grieving process. Even in the animals, they seem like they get back to their daily routine a bit faster.
Yeah, I agree. I know even we had the opportunity when my mom passed away to take her dog that we adopted to the funeral home. They were nice enough to let us bring him to the funeral home, and he smelled her. And I think that was life changing because she had been sick and been gone, and he was kind of looking for her and didn't know what was going on. And so that gave him that ability to understand, you know, what he could in that situation, that she was no longer alive. So I do agree. I think that's great when we have that opportunity. Sometimes we don't, but I think it can, I know this might sound crazy, but it seems like the body puts off a smell too when they pass away. Like there's like something that changes, right? And so like even bringing a collar or something that was on them when they passed away, or a blanket, right, to signify, and maybe even talking to our pets with our kids about it, right? Just like even treating them kind of like a human. Maybe they don't understand, but I think they kind of do, are able to kind of pick up on that energy. Do you feel like that could be helpful too?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially like you said, the sniffing, there's something about that. And, you know, dogs can smell so much more than we can. And I think it's somehow that it's just, they understand, like you said, to some degree, but they know they're not coming back. And it's like, it helps them. And, And honestly, that's such a beautiful thing that you said about your dog with your mom. I mean, I think that's great that, they're not searching because you'll see pets, they just circle around the house and you can tell they're just looking. So I like the idea of blankets and collars too. I think that's a good option as well, especially, like I said, emergency type situations where you can't have all this time and coordination. And I think talking with them, especially with our kids, because sometimes I think that helps the kids too. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be a very sweet way, just again, because it's going to take more than one conversation, with your kids. Yeah. It's sad. So I think that's the other thing of being prepared for is you're going to have to talk about this more than once. They're going to bring it up, especially depending on the age, quite a bit. And so you're just going to have to be prepared to keep answering some of these questions, and they're just going to keep bringing it up.
Yeah. Well, and as you were talking, I was thinking about something that we did, which was to have my kids. So the cats, we have some cats at our house too. And when our last dog passed away, I had the kids tell the cats about what happened. And it also helped me to understand what they understood. And I think that's, the therapist in me. Sometimes I don't think about those tools that I have that maybe other people aren't doing, but that was really helpful because then it helped me, right? Even our 2-year-old was like, the dog died. Right? He's not coming back. Like death is forever. And he's talking to the cats about this. And I was like, okay, we've got that. Now, obviously he's 2. So like, we're going to have this conversation over and over again. Right. And as he develops, so how do you think, so something that I think, for us, we've even struggled with is like, when do you bring a new pet in? I think, oftentimes we are sad about that and we want to like, grieve the pet that we had, not to like tarnish their memory, but then also like we might need that companionship. So like how do you decide when your family is ready?
And that's a great question. I feel like it's very different. I feel like some people need a big space, like just a time to grieve, and it's almost like their heart isn't ready versus other people. They also they need, like you said, they need that companion. They like having dogs around, and it doesn't mean that they love their pet any less. It's just, kind of just their flow of their house, their family. And so there's a couple different ways to do it. I know a lot of people who actually get puppies or another dog when they know one of them is getting older. Mm-hmm. And some thought is, as long as your other dog actually likes other dogs, that's sort of a kicker. If your other dog hates other dogs, then please don't do that because you're just going to add stress.
Sure.
But assuming they like other dogs, or at least this other one you bring in, do a trial run, you can start to kind of get that personality. It almost seems like, the dog, the older one that you have can kind of teach, if you will, or, kind of pass along some of those personality traits. And so I think that can be sort of a sweet thing that you can see. And sometimes they can even help with their energy. If you have a younger dog the older dog kind of wants to play a little bit, so it's sometimes that can be a good balance. Otherwise, I don't know. It's so different. I know people who will get dogs the next day. Some people another year. I would say there's not a good rule of thumb. Mm-hmm. But just sort of feeling out what feels good in your family. But I do feel like if you like having animals in your house, then I would think about, as long as, like I said, your dog or cat even likes other animals, maybe trying to introduce them, when you know that they're starting to get old and they might pass away in the next few months, year or so, but this other pet can kind of learn from them.
Yeah. And I love this idea. I think people sometimes, get stuck on this idea of like when the right time is. And I think there is no right time, right? It's what makes sense for your family and for your heart. And if you need to wait, then wait, embrace that. That's okay. But if you feel like you're ready, then embrace that. It's okay. There's not a right way to do this. Grief is so personal and everybody is going to do it their own way. So it's totally okay to do it just like that. I know that we had a cat that we got an illness that as a new cat to us, this was years ago, and it was FIP. And so that's one of those things that you just can't, there's no cure and it's painful. And so we chose to put that cat down. And when we left the vet, our kids were like, when are we getting a new cat? And I'm like, hold on. We literally just put the cat down. Like, can we pause this conversation, please? But we ended up not waiting that long because I felt like, my kids were ready and I was able to rally to be ready. But it was good. How it ended up working out was fine. But I think everybody's situation is different. And, we have to respect that. Like sometimes we do need time and we can say to our kids, like, I'm not ready yet, or I am ready. Right. And seeing what the energy of the rest of the house is. So that's really good advice that you've had clients that have done all the things. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, because you made the point of people always want to know, when is it time? When is the right time, like to euthanize? And I get that all the time. And it's like you said, there is no right time. I think there's different things you can do, like, talking with your vet. And if your vet is worried that they are suffering or, in a lot of pain, then that's probably, the time is coming pretty quickly. Or, measuring quality of life or goals, of what your pet can do. But what I find too, and you let me know your thoughts on this, is there's so much feeling of guilt with euthanizing a pet. And so I feel like for a lot of people, part of that question of when is it the right time, I feel like what they're also saying is, I feel too guilty. If I do it too soon, I'm going to beat myself up. If I wait too long, I'm going to beat myself up. But I just feel guilty making this decision because we don't make it. Do you think that's what you would say as a therapist? Probably, because that's what I've noticed clinically.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so hard because there is not a right time, right? And there's a lot of guilt, right? Of like, I should know how to handle this. I should be prepared. But the reality is that you'll never feel that way. I don't think, right? I think and so it's like looking at the goals that you have for that pet, like how you know that they feel good. And that's what I've used personally as my guidepost is quality of life. Like I think, as humans, based on our society, we do have to suffer sometimes, right? That end of life can be uncomfortable. And we do the best that we can in medicine. But with pets, we have this opportunity to help them to be comfortable to the end, right? And so I think when we're thinking about that, I would encourage people to just look at quality of life. I mean, I think, are they able to do the things they want to do? Or do they seem happy? Are they getting up for treats? Are they, interested in their food? I mean, none of our dogs have ever not liked food. Food is like the thing. Do they still want to be your vacuum cleaner, right? To clean up all the kids' scraps, right? Like these things that they enjoy and that are bringing joy to their lives. Are they still doing those things? And when the quality of life is poor, then I think you can decide with your vet, what does that mean? And that's been helpful for me personally.
Yeah. No, I'm a huge proponent of quality of life. I think sometimes even in people, we sort of forget, quality of life. Like, what are the goals with doing this treatment? What is the goal? And I think with animals, we're maybe a little bit better about that conversation, but just really saying like, okay, well, we can do this big surgery, but the expectation and the outcome will likely be this. Does that fit with your goals? Does that fit with the quality of life that you want for your pet?
Yeah. Yeah. And that can be hard because sometimes we don't know. But I think, like thinking about they're there and they're leaning on us to keep them in a good, comfortable place, right? Whatever that means, like they need us to do those things for us or for them. And so I think they kind of give us the permission, right, to make those decisions for them. They trust us to make that. And yeah, I think I haven't regretted any of the decisions that I've made in terms of pet care, but it is hard sometimes, right? Like, what is the point of even that treatment, even if it's not life ending, right? Like that thing, is it going to help for a long time or short time? And does that make sense with our family? I think that can be a hard place. It definitely pulls at our heartstrings for sure. So what do you want parents or our audience to kind of take away from this conversation? We've covered a lot of things around death and loss of pets. What do you want them to take away?
I think the takeaway is that death is natural and it's inevitable. So it is important that we have this conversation with our kids. I think it's important to be direct so that they truly understand, at whatever level, that what's about death and what's happening. And I think it's important to really think through these decisions and know that at the end of the day, you've made the best choice with the information you had at the time. So even though we all feel guilty and that's normal, but trying not to beat ourselves up too much because your kids are going to notice that too, if you're carrying around a lot of guilt. And one other thing I hadn't mentioned yet is another thing to think about is when you are actually euthanizing your pet, if it's something, do you want to bring your kids there? Because I think older kids, it can be helpful because they just see, again, it's usually very peaceful and controlled. And if there are going to be some things, the vet will say, we'll kind of prep people like, we might see some fluid or they might have some big breaths, things like that. So I think that can be a good thing for a kid to see. Again, this depends on your family and your choices. But I've seen a lot of older kids with that. And that seems like it also helps them have some closure. But if you have little kids, like babies or toddlers, I think you have to decide, because I found that sometimes they just don't get it. So they're actually distracting the parents. So the parents can't really grieve in that moment because the kids, they don't understand. And so they're just wanting mommy's attention, period. So that's something to think about too, is in that moment, just, do you have your kids there? Do you get a babysitter? Do you have them present? That kind of thing. And then also, like we mentioned, your other pets. I've had people bring, their other pet so that they can see, or like you said, maybe having them smell the collar or blankets or things so that they also get some closure.
Yeah. Well, and one other idea with that, part of being present in the euthanasia process is the kids could be there, see the pet before they are put to sleep or when they have the sedation medication, step out and then come back in to see that they have passed. I think the concreteness of that is really helpful, that they're not alive anymore, can really help kids and us really honestly to go through that. But I think, some families choose to euthanize and not be there. And there's no shame in that. Like, I think you do what you can do. That feels best for you. But I think also there's lots of options. There's lots of variety in this and there's no right. But I think the thing that we know for sure is being honest with our kids about what's happening is helpful for their processing through this process. And then also being direct, saying they have died or they are going to die, or this, euthanasia, the process will make their heart stop beating. And if our heart isn't beating, then we can't live, right? Like that's a sign that we're no longer here, that we have died. And so I think those concrete things help kids to understand that process.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for being here today. This has been such a great conversation. Sad, but I think we're all going to go through this, but also just really informative.
Well, thank you. It's certainly been my pleasure. And I'm glad however I can help out, because it's a tough situation, but we often, if you have pets at some point, you're going to be at this crossroads.
Thanks again for your time today, Dr. Venable. That was all really helpful information. I know this is a tough topic and can be really hard for us to navigate with our kids, but hopefully this gives you some guidance on how to navigate pet loss with your kids. With that, I will say thank you for your time today. Like and subscribe to our show. Give us a rating. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, and keep the emails coming with podcast topic suggestions to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a great day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.